Dr. Wiedenfeld here to talk about politically critical cinemas. Interesting name. It means uh, if you think that everything is political, then we're talking about movies that really know that they're political. So I'm going to give a little background on that idea and then cover it in three parts of the world, explain what that means later. So, first question of why being explicitly political? Well, and especially during this period, there's a lot of unrest. There's the Cold War and then proxy wars that are often related to the Cold War. They're flamed by the Cold War, like, in the US, as in Korea in the 50s, Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. There are the CIA is involved in all kinds of overthrowing or maneuvering for governments to be in power, especially in this kind of neo-colonial way, especially in Latin America and in Brazil. So here, this is from Chile, the picture from Chile in 1973, where there's democratically elected President Allende, who's overthrown by a CIA-backed military coup led by General Pinochet, who then comes into power. So, I mean, that's just a general example of the kind of unrest that's all over the place. There was unrest, which is why Allende came to power in the first place. For poverty, there's oppression for religious, ethnic, gender, women are oppressed, queer, LGBT oppression. So if I'm just saying in general across the whole world, I mean, these things are always there, but there was a certain peak around 1968 and 70 in a lot of different places for a variety of reasons. There was political unrest, and cinema just followed along with that. Why is cinema so important? Well, I mean, art in general and its relation to politics. This goes back in one way to Romanticism, where romantic art is about free thinking. The individual genius is both it can be connected to the democratic republic, the value of every individual, and something like the French Revolution was tied with certain kinds of romantic thought. So art has always, modern art has always been related to politics in that way, in a sense. And then there was also a revival of socialist ideas about art from the early 20th century, from the especially the 20s and 30s, that come back into force at this time. One of those, kind of related from this earlier time, there's kind of an unorthodox socialist, Bertolt Brecht, and he fits into this picture that all art is political. One way to think about that is to say, well, I just want to see entertainment. I don't want politics. I just want to be entertained. Well, if you think about, every aspect of your life can be tied into these broader struggles and relationships of power. Well, if you just want to sit back and be entertained from a certain perspective, one can say that this is a conservative position. You want to be passive. You want to just accept the status quo, the way things are. I'm happy with the way things are. I just want to have some pleasure. Well, if you're somebody who's pushing for change, then you would see that entertainment view as, in fact, very conservative, a kind of, Marxist term, or Marx and Engels term, opiate of the masses, which is how they describe religion as what was inhibiting change? Well, people, they just want entertainment. They're afraid of change. Well, so you can see how entertainment can be seen as political in a conservative way. So the kind of art that Brecht theorizes, drama specifically, to start change is what's called the alienation effect, estrangement, or distancing effect. Verfremdungseffekt. Sorry, I have terrible German. But it takes you out of this comfortable place and puts you in a place of thinking, wait, why are things this way? Now I want to reflect critically about it and asking some questions. Maybe I'm a little skeptical of the truth, and I'm going to resist identification with the characters on screen. The movie wants me to like this character. Should I really like this character? Maybe it's trying to manipulate me. So you can see how there's a higher mind here in this alienation effect. And then lastly, for cinema to get involved, because cinema is an expensive art, it takes institutional support. And as we saw with the Soviets in the 20s, they see cinema as very important for mass communication. If you're going to get political message or any kind of social movement, just have people talking and thinking about something, cinema is is the modern way to do that. Okay, now let's go to the kind of three different areas. And you may hear people informally talking about the third world as kind of a derogatory term, like, oh, there's a third world kind of thing. Well, whoever's saying that doesn't understand where the term comes from. It comes from the Cold War. There was the First World. This was the U.S. and countries allied with it in Western Europe, Australia, Japan. You had the Second World, which was the USSR and its allied countries. And then the Third World were countries that became gathered in what's known as a non-aligned movement. And I have the flag up in the corner there. They didn't want to align. They didn't want to get involved in the Cold War and have to pick sides. They just wanted freedom. And they didn't want, tied in with not being colonies and this decolonization movement. So, Global South, you can see, fits with it generally. And so this is the Third World had this meaning in the 60s and 70s, which is going to be important in a minute. So let's start in Cuba. There was a revolution in 1959. Cuba had kind of been sort of like a client state of the U.S. and wanted kind of self-determination. It's socialist oriented, as if you're going to be against the U.S., you're probably going to be socialist, because the U.S. at this time is in the capitalist liberal side. And so Fidel Castro leads a revolution, and they see cinema is very important. They start a state film institute, the Instituto Cubano del Arte y Industrias Cinematográficos, which is what gives institutional support to young filmmakers, and new generation of filmmakers, and who are given, unlike the kind of Soviet style of socialist realism, they're given a little more freedom to experiment. And you see Tomas Gutierrez Alea's Memories of Underdevelopment, which is going to mix some documentary footage with this kind of fictional framework around a character who's this intellectual, meaning they're kind of bourgeois or upper middle class professional who's unsure about whether he wants to support the revolution or not. I believe it's set in the recent past. It's set kind of during the revolution. So, and he's kind of dealing with those issues, but the documentary stuff is much more kind of almost direct cinema style. Okay, so let me just take a step back here and look at some of the general tendencies of style that we see in politically critical cinema. Generally, they're alternatives to Hollywood. As before, this idea that Hollywood entertainment tends to be about the status quo. And so picking up on all kinds of styles that are different from Hollywood. This is neorealism, cinema verite or direct cinema, and documentary, new wave, which is also picking up on those earlier two. And then, to go further back in time to Soviet montage. Okay, another film in Latin America that, it's actually some film. Let me talk about film and filmmakers who are very important. And that is, who do I have there? Yeah, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino, Argentine filmmakers. And you see the Solanas, he had, I believe it was wrote a book and then also made it into a film, kind of an essay style, La Hora de los Hornos, Hour of the Furnaces. Important anti-colonial text and thinking. They're leftist filmmakers in Argentina, and there was a certain time where they're supportive of Perón, who had come to power, but that's a whole nother story. What I want to focus on from them. So there's this film, and then tied with it, they had a very important text called Hacia un tercer cine, toward a third cinema. So third world, third cinema, and here in this, and it was printed in this journal called Tricontinental, 3 continents, 3 cinemas, 3 worlds. Those 3 continents are going to be, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or the Americas. And the idea was that, okay, if, first, Hollywood is kind of the first world cinema. They called second cinema, not Soviet, but actually art films, which could be more reform-minded, but they didn't really see it as activist enough. So third cinema they see as guerrilla-style, independent filmmaking. And one of the important things about their view of political cinema is that it isn't just the message of the film itself. It's a whole vision about what it means to go to the movies. And you're not going to just be entertained. It's more like going to a class or like a political meeting or like a lecture where you're going to learn something, and there's going to be discussion as part of it. So the film, is maybe might, in the Brechtian way, make you pose some questions, make you angry. And the idea is that then you're going to talk about what those things are right now. And it's going to be this new kind of coming to consciousness about what are the problems out there, what are the changes that need to be happening. And it doesn't have to be the central distribution. It can be, independent guerrilla style, on the grassroots level. So you can see the politics for that Solanas and Getino think about is not just, they use some Soviet montage, but it isn't just about this montage style. They're open to a lot of different styles. It's some part of it is just this approach of, we're not going to be making films that are funded by, big companies trying to make money, because they're those companies that are wanting to make money, they're going to kind of control the content. We want to be actually have the activists be in control of the filmmaking and leading discussion and putting those political goals first and foremost. Okay, now speaking of Tricontinental, let's go to Africa. There's a lot of connections with Latin America here, but and with the U.S. there's Pan-Africanism and Negritude movements that are happening sort of throughout the 20th century, and this go hand in hand with this decolonization movement. Some of these, like Negritude actually starts in Paris because there's a lot of countries in Africa, especially West Africa, that were French colonies in the 20s and 30s and whatnot. So folks from those areas would go up to the home country, to Paris and France to study, and then together they kind of see, there's something that we all have in common, even though you're from Senegal and you're from Togo and you're from Tunisia. Well, we perhaps have something in common. And that is that we're all been colonized by France and we all want independence. So what does this mean for cinema? Cinema is part of this movement. A number of festivals get founded in Burkina Faso. There's FESCAPO, which is an acronym in French, which stands for Pan-African Film and Television Festival of Ouagadougou. So it's been around since, biennial, every 2 years. It's been around since 1969. I'm going to highlight one filmmaker here, Ousmane Sembène, from Senegal, lived some in France. His film Black Girl or La Noire 2. So aside from FESCAPO, look at some of the prizes it has here. It won prize at the International Festival of Carthage, another important African film festival here in 1966, and at the Dakar Arts Festival, Black Arts Festival. So, and this is a film about a woman, I think from Senegal, goes to France and kind of wants to live the immigrant dream of going up to this wealthy country, and she has this great opportunity, and she's basically stuck as a domestic servant, barely treated as a full person for this white family in Marseille. So it's called an exile film in the sense that it doesn't take place in Africa. It's about African diasporic person, somebody who's from Africa, who's left Africa, and what's their experience abroad when they've traveled abroad. And it's political because there's so few films at this time, especially in Western Europe, that even have a black perspective. So it was almost radical at the time to have a black perspective and to put this wealthy white family in the position of kind of the villains, if not the antagonists. That was radical at the time. So exile film is one, now here I'm backing out to get the big picture again. Some of the genres that were most common for, politically critical cinema, like historical subjects, Potemkin being the story about like a historical revolution. In fact, it was a failed revolution, but some important historical event is always going to be political. Films about exiles abroad, that especially is going to tie in with the colonial theme. Return to the Sources, I'll talk about in a minute. An essay I'll also talk about. Return to the Sources, especially in African cinema. Here's another Sembène film, The Outsiders, 1977. A woman's challenge to Islam sparks a revolt. This is the English language poster there. Although I love the the cover image on the right, which is from Criterion Collection. And so Return to the Sources is filmmakers that are interested in folklore, oral traditions, and often there's, in folklore there's magic, there's fantasy involved, but and there are character types like the magician. So using some of those, it can be traditional stories, but mixed with contemporary themes. So it's a way of kind of going back to the roots of the oral tradition, but also using it to make political commentaries about contemporary life. And here in the case of like religious and political conflict in Senegal. Okay, so those are a couple highlights from politically conscious cinema in the third world. I'm going to go to the second world, Soviet bloc, which I'm going to skip over China, which kind of breaks away during the Cultural Revolution after 1960 with Mao. But let's focus on the center here, Soviet Union. We talked about in previous lectures that there's this thaw after Stalin dies. There's the first kind of thaw before 1958 when Khrushchev comes to power. He criticizes Stalin and the cult of personality around him. Now there's some thaw, and then things open up a little too quickly. Like there's a crackdown that happens in Hungary in I think 1956, and even by the early 60s, Brezhnev comes to power in 64. It was slightly before that. Things are getting colder and more conservative again. This sense of crackdown and crackdown on the free expression and following the central party ideology for the kinds of movies that should be made. 1968 I picked because this is the Prague. There's a Prague spring kind of moment of opening, and that is brutally repressed with sending the tanks and the army in to invade in Prague. So in the 60s, so there's before that in like the late 60s there's still some, but what kind of politically critical cinema can you have after that? Well, Yugoslavia, you may remember, they're often the most connected to the West and Western Europe. Tito, the dictator there, he has a certain special distance from the USSR, and so they have vibrant cinema. Here's a co-production with Italy, the Petrovich, called. He makes a number of films that are seen as politically critical: the Master and Margarita or Master and Margaret, '72, and maybe not so much in this film, but in other films. The part of the cold conservatism is around sexual behavior, or sexual morality, if you want to call it that. In that the kind of young people who are interested in new kinds of socialism and reviving socialism, they're interested in sexual freedom. There's new kinds of contraception that are happening, that are available at this time, and you'll kind of see this dialectic, perhaps as one theme. The crackdown in the sex and sexual desire, and realizing that desire is seen as part of the reform element, whereas the repression and sexual modesty is the more conservative side. Okay, I wouldn't say that Tarkovsky's film fits that theme of the kind of eroticism as a way to revive socialism. Not an erotic film. This is political in a different way that might not be obvious, and that's in the second world, like the socialist, communist themes and ideas, those are conservative, or at least one kind of socialism is that the people in power decide this is the conservative. And so if you're for change and being conscious, politically conscious of the situation and change, that can also be about individuality, as opposed to, in the most general terms, communism is about the community, it's about the collective, and the individual feelings and life and individual contemplation is usually associated with the capitalist West. That individuals get tied up in all these things and they lose sight of the collective struggle. So Tarkovsky's interesting. He's so famous that he's able to make movies that are fairly individual, and there's sort of a mystical contemplation element to it, very intellectual. So the argument can be made that it is political in that sense. Political allegories can be read in it. I mean, I think it's so ambiguous. It's not clearly anti-USSR, at least from what I know, from the little that I've studied it. But you do see that it's at odds with the kind of socialist realism or pedagogical realism that comes into force here. So, well, I haven't said anything about the film yet. It is science fiction. It's on a space station here, and this poster, which is I don't think it's original, I think it comes later, gives you an idea that this is psychological science fiction. And the question of what is real, what is appearance, really makes this a deeply interesting film. Probably a lot more interesting to think about than something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, from roughly the same, or a couple of years prior. Okay, so there's a couple looks at the second world. Okay, let's now go to first world, and so here we're thinking about a coalition of social movements that are against the system, that come together really around peak years 1968 to 70 that I talked about. This is, has to do with like the war in Vietnam. It has to do with, in the U.S. with civil rights, for, minorities, Black, Latino, Latina, women, Native American or Indian, and queer. There's and the working class in general, this sort of working class that's getting sent off to fight this war in Vietnam, and the conditions at home are hard to be proud of. So that's the U.S. In Europe. I mean, some of the key filmmakers though are European names that we've talked about before, like Godard in France, Oshima in Japan, Pasolini in Italy. They start making very politically radical films, and they start thinking about history in ways that are, unrealistic. They're not telling a straightforward history. Very skeptical about how you're telling the story. What are the myths that are at play? This is kind of the Brechtian approach to thinking about history. The New Left, as opposed to the an old left that would be associated with the USSR or kind of old style like labor union organizing. That's a little more socially conservative. Here, New Left, it's kind of intellectual liberation and has these other cultural elements as well. Some important American filmmaker here that expresses what I mentioned before is Emile de Antonio, and he made a film about Vietnam called In the Year of a Pig. In the Year of the Pig, evocative photo here that, immediately, if you've, Full Metal Jacket from '86, it looks directly back at something like this. This is a nonfiction film. It's a documentary that's using interviews and footage that was, too graphic to be played on television, and putting that into a film form. And what it's really doing is, and sometimes clashing with the interviews of officials. And so, they're kind of, their statements about what's happening in Vietnam are often in conflict with what you're seeing in the images, and creates a sort of skepticism about the establishment and the kinds of the kinds of things that it's saying is true about the war and in various ways. We'll talk a little bit more about the style of this film in next another lecture on documentary. Okay. Let's go to Belgium. Very important feminist filmmaker, Chantal Akerman. And the great title of this film, which is A Woman and Her Address in Brussels. Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quai du Commerce, and then the zip code in Brussels. This is minimalist style. So rather than the kind of the opposite of this like Soviet montage essay style. In fact, no, we're spending time with this character. It's like a 3+ hour long film, 3 days in her life. And, she's a widow. She's just doing things around the house. Prostitution figures into that. But it's not this kind of, it's not like a dramatic story. It's much more about the everydayness of the life that she lives, and leads to kind of contemplation about her whole situation and how that all fits together, especially for her as a woman in Belgium at this time. And then one other example. There are so many examples, but one other important genre to get at is the political thriller. So this is a little more mainstream. This is a great example of Z is a great example of a mainstream politically charged movie, and Costa Gavras is a Greek filmmaker, and this film is loosely based on, a Greek politician who was assassinated by some right-wing, kind of conspiracy nuts in, conspiratists in, 5 or 6 years prior to this. And so it's, a somewhat fictionalized account. And, the Z is, I guess, in Greek meant something like he is alive, about the like center. It was a, more leftist politician who was assassinated. One thing I didn't talk about was the essay film, which we'll get into that a little bit more in documentary. But in the, in general here, it's a little sort of hard to pull this together into a clear story because I'm talking about all over the world. Why do I do it this way? Well, other lectures have focused on the most important art filmmakers, and politics, political films don't tend to be the most successful either at the box office or at festivals. Hence, the whole idea of third cinema that Solanas and Haitino had. So it can be useful just to think that like this is out there everywhere, especially at this time, and it's worth seeing, worth thinking about as something that's always present, even if it isn't in the central focus of those other those like art and industry in certain regions. The political cinema is focused more on politics, but it's key for movies in their life and in their public life is not just about entertainment. It's a medium for communication in all different kinds of ways, and politics is one of that. And one area where some of the most interesting work happens because they're trying to break from established ways of making movies, watching movies, and to tie political change into the what cinema is and how it's as a social practice. So that's politically critical cinemas of the 60s and the 70s.